Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your new host, Blake Johnson. On this week's episode, we begin with the Biden administration's recent policy changes for H-1B visa petitions and what it means for the adjudication process within the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services Agency. Next, we have Customs and Border Protection's June report on encounters at the southwest border. The team will break it down from the top lines to the trend lines and what they mean for Vice President Harris's call to address root causes. And finally, for the big story of the week, we're bringing you a new segment of The Gavel to review the Texas District Court's decision against the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. We'll cover the ruling, its effects on Dreamers, plus whether Congress can use the Reconciliation Authority to push through a permanent legislative solution. More of that to come, so stick around. USCIS has issued some changes to adjudication policies issued under the Trump administration. BBC previously wrote about the impact of these policies on increases in requests for evidence and denials, specifically for H-1B petitioners. We took the opportunity to see if these rates have changed ahead of these new policies by the Biden administration. As many of our listeners know, it is summer intern season here in Washington, D.C., and we're excited to feature two of them on this episode. First up is Andrew Lee, who co-authored our blog on this H-1B issue. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew. What specific policies did the Biden administration change that were resulting in high levels of request for evidence?
Yeah, so under the Biden administration, although, the data for fiscal year 21 hasn't fully come out since it's only been 2 quarters since they've been in office, but we've already started to see a reversal of the Trump administration trends. Under the Trump administration, we saw an increase in the number of petitions that receive an RFE from about 21% from before 2018, when the administration really started pushing a flurry of restrictive policies, from 21% in fiscal year 17 to 38 and 40% in the following years. And we're already seeing under the Biden administration, with all of these changes, dropping back to a kind of a pre-Trump era level of RFE requests. And also, even if the petitions did receive an RFE request, we actually see that there's a higher level of those being accepted. So under the Biden administration, there's a much better environment for an H-1B employer to petition for a foreign worker to come here versus the Trump administration period.
So thanks for that, Andrew. But what did you find has happened so far under the Biden administration with regard to the adjudication data?
And one of the final changes so far that we've tracked with the Biden administration was a return to a 2013 policy for USCIS adjudication regarding request for further evidence, also known as RFEs, and notice of intent to deny, which are also known as NOIDs, which during the Trump administration in 2018 reversed it so that a USCIS adjudicator could deny benefit request for lack of initial evidence, and they did not have, and now under the 2018 rule, they didn't have to give an RFE or NOID. And the Biden administration returned it to its normal state, where that the USCIS adjudicator would have to send one so that the petitioner could fix their mistakes if they made some, instead of just getting denied outright.
Thanks, Andrew. That's great. And Andrew, what school are you going to and what are you studying?
Yeah, so I'm a rising junior at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm double majoring right now in anthropology and Spanish.
Thanks for all your hard work on this subject. Now for an update on the border situation. CBP released last month's data on its encounters at the southwest border on July 16th, and it appears that total encounters have gone up, signaling a continuing trend and possibly putting us on a path to see more than 1 million encounters in this fiscal year. However, at BPC, we always look below the top line numbers, and there are some interesting underlying trends worth paying attention to. So, here to break it down, our immigration fellow, Sadiksha Nepal, Teresa Brown, our Managing Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy, and our other BPC immigration intern for this summer, Grace Klunder. Sadiksha, let's start with you. What did the June 2021 month look like at the border? Are we, again, looking at sky-high numbers?
We are looking at an increase, yes, but it's holding steady. I would say there's a couple of thousand more migrant entry into the United States. But what's more interesting is if you look at the breakdown of the demographics of who is entering. I think for the first time since January or this fiscal year, single adults have dipped a little bit from 117 of almost 118,000 to like around 113,000. This is the first time that has happened in a little bit. And so we have to wait and see if this trend holds. But what's fascinating is that family units are still increasing. That has had a significant increase in family units coming into the country. We've gone from 40,000 to 50,000. Majority of them are still being turned away under Title 42. There's also a little bit of an increase in unaccompanied minors, as we know that the Biden administration has halted applying Title 42 to unaccompanied minors and some families who can't go back to Mexico or Mexico won't take back. So, the trend holds and we are seeing an increase. But what's interesting is that for the first time in June, CBP released individual encounters to find out what the recidivism rate might be. And they've designated 124,000 people enter the United States. These are unique individuals coming in, which is for the first time CBP is releasing this. So this is like a very interesting fact that we now know. It has also been reported that 34% of all encounters in June were repeat crossers who have attempted to cross into the United States last year. And what we at BPC are now starting to track is the number of nationals from other countries besides Mexico and from Northern Triangle who are entering into the United States. As we know that Mexicans and those from Northern Triangles still are the highest number of migrants coming into the United States. But what's interesting now is that these countries who were previously labeled as other nationalities have been on a significant incline. And our intern can talk about that more.
Well, with that, let's go to Grace. Grace, first question. Where do you go to school and what are you studying?
Hi, thanks for having me. I go to school at UNC Chapel Hill in North Carolina, and I'm studying economics and public policy.
Wonderful. Well, look, we've had you focusing on migrants and those coming from countries other than Mexico or those in Central America. So what trends are you seeing and where are these other migrants coming from?
Yeah, so like Sadiqa just touched on, there are a record number of migrants coming from Mexico and Central America. But what has been somewhat overlooked is the rapid increases in migrants arriving from countries in South America, the Caribbean, and even as far away as Central Europe. So what I did was I looked at all the countries sending migrants to the United States that CBP tracks, and I looked at the number of migrants they sent in June 2020 and June 2021. Then I compared the relative growths of encounters from each country, and what I found, which I thought was pretty astounding, considering the current general immigration conversation, was that not even one of the top 5 fastest growing migrant sending countries to the United States was Mexico or any of the Northern Triangle countries. So the top 5 countries that are increasing their share of migrant encounters to the U.S. in descending order are Venezuela, Brazil, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Haiti. And to just give an idea of how drastic the differences in growth are between these countries and Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries, well, let me just give you the statistics. So Venezuelan encounters between June 2020 and June 2021 grew by 13,951%. And now comparing that to Mexico, which only grew about 137% between June 2020 and June 2021, I think that's pretty crazy. And so I also mentioned earlier that some migrants are coming as far as Central Europe, and who I'm mainly talking about are Romanians. So in all of fiscal year 2020, just 1,486 migrants from Romania were encountered by CBP. And only about 19% of those migrants came to the southern border. However, those migration trends seem to have changed pretty dramatically in fiscal year 2021 so far. Already, the U.S. has encountered 4,369 Romanian migrants, and 81% of those are now being encountered at the southern border. So There are a lot of factors influencing these rapid increases in migrant encounters from countries outside of Mexico and the Northern Triangle. And there are a lot of factors involved in the changing migration patterns from countries like Romania. But the point really to be made here is that these trends are worth paying attention to so that CBP can be proactive in its efforts to manage migration to the United States.
Grace, thanks so much for that. Teresa, we're going to turn it over to you. What does this mean? We've gotten a lot of data here from Sadiksha and Grace. What are we looking at? And is the Biden administration succeeding at managing migration right now? What do the numbers mean for Central America if they're not surging from those countries? What does that mean for Vice President Harris's efforts to address root causes?
Well, those are all the right questions, Blake. And what you heard from Sadiksha and Grace is important. We're still seeing large numbers from Mexico and Central America. So I do think the effort at dealing with Central America, particularly because it's our near neighborhood, is important. The single adult numbers from Mexico are highly reflective of the use of this Title 42 expulsion, and the recidivism rate is really key to understanding that. Back in the 1990s and early 2000s, when we saw huge numbers of encounters at the southwest border, 99% of them were Mexican, and most of them were single adults. And one of the things that drove that was that most Mexicans were processed and returned to Mexico quite quickly. So for Mexicans trying to come to the United States, the process looks very similar to how it did then. There's very low opportunity cost, if you will, and risk to a Mexican person in trying to come to the United States right now, because they can try again fairly quickly. For the Central Americans who are really seeking asylum, and I'd say most Mexican single adults are not, it's still a concern. The fact that families are ticking up again, that unaccompanied minors might be ticking up again. Again, the Biden administration hasn't fundamentally changed their process, but Mexico is now rejecting more families. And so what's the tension right now for the Biden administration is figuring out how they manage increasing flows. And many of the people from countries other than Central America, Mexico won't take back. So they are being allowed into the United States. What does that do to our asylum system and our immigration courts? They're already very backlogged. The Biden administration has said they want to reconfigure the asylum system for border crossers, but they haven't done anything yet. They probably will need to go through rulemaking, notice and comment. That takes time, but they may not be given that time if migrants start increasing. And Title 42 is tentative. I'd say the courts are still waiting to rule on whether or not the use of Title 42, as it's been used since the Trump administration, is lawful. The ACLU, which is the lead plaintiff in the case against the government's use of this for families, has been negotiating with the Biden administration on taking it down. But I think that there's a growing frustration that it's not being taken down sooner. And, the articulation of the reason for the Title 42 order of public health seems to be somewhat fading as Mexico and the United States increase their population of people vaccinated. There was a recent study of the unaccompanied children in HHS care that a smaller proportion of them tested positive for COVID than in the state of Texas generally. And a higher percentage of them were getting vaccinated when they were offered the vaccination. So the idea that migrants coming from the southwest border are a significant vector for spreading COVID doesn't necessarily seem to be borne out. So I think the Biden administration is probably at a little bit of a crossroads. They're going to have to, if they're going to do something different with the asylum system, they're going to have to do something soon. Title 42 may go away sooner than they would like. And when it does, they will have to process every one of those people rather than sending them back. What we'll have to watch is whether that would impact the number of Mexicans coming in when they now face immigration consequences, and what happens to these other countries. As Grace mentioned, this is a trend we want to follow. What's happening seems to be that for those facilitating migrants, smuggling them to the border, the southwest border is the preferred place of arrival for people from all around the world. And that means that we have to not think about this just in terms of Mexico and Central America, but what's happening in those countries, and probably have to deal with different reasons for migrating, origin issues. We're probably going to have to look at other countries along those smuggling routes and what can we do to work with them to address this. But I think there's more work to be done, clearly.
Thanks for that, Teresa. And just to follow up, what did the Biden administration do on Title 42 last week? I saw that in the news somewhere.
Yeah. So, as part of the court case, the Biden administration agreed to formally rescind the Title 42 order as it applied to unaccompanied children. Just to go back, remember that the Biden administration by policy had decided not to apply the order to unaccompanied children since February of 2021, but they formally rescinded the order for that population. It still remains in place for everyone else. So that hasn't come down yet, but it was a move to sort of dismantle the Title 42 orders.
Thanks, everyone. That was a great segment. A lot of data you threw at everybody, and I'm sure we'll have a lot to process in the coming months as we look at these emerging trends. And finally, with the courts generating this week's biggest immigration news, we close out this week's program with the gavel. On Friday, July 16th, federal judge Andrew Hannon in the Southern District of Texas issued his long-awaited ruling in the lawsuit filed by the state of Texas and 8 others challenging the legality of the DACA program. As was widely expected, Judge Hannon ruled the program violated the Administrative Procedures Act when created and is not legal. Let's get a breakdown on this decision, and we'll also look at what Congress can do. Let's welcome back Sadiksha and Teresa. Welcome you both. So first, let's break down the decision. Teresa, what was the decision and on what basis did Judge Hannon rule? And then what does that mean for current DACA holders and those that have applied since the program was reopened?
So just to give a little context for those who might not remember, way back in 2014, Judge Hannon ruled against the expansion of the DACA program and its corollary for parents of U.S. citizens and permanent residents, the DAPA program, and said that those programs exceeded the government's statutory authority and didn't follow the Administrative Procedures Act because they were created by a memorandum the same way the DACA program was. That case eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, and the lower court decision was upheld when the Supreme Court deadlocked 4-4 because of the vacancy that was not filled at the end of the Obama administration. So the DACA case had been pending around for a long time. Now, the Trump administration had tried to end the DACA program, so the litigants in that case on DACA basically put it in abeyance, said, well, if the administration is going to end the DACA program, then our court case doesn't need to go forward. Well, as we now know, the Trump administration's attempts to end the DACA program also went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled that he did not end the program properly. That meant that the DACA program, as it existed, continued, and a subsequent court case against the administration said that they had to basically put the DACA program back the way it was when it was created in 2012. So new applicants could apply, existing applicants could renew. That was the state of affairs until this ruling. And what Judge Hannon said was that, similar to his ruling on DAPA and the expanded DACA, that first of all, creating such a program through a memorandum without giving the public an opportunity to provide notice and comment was unlawful. It violated the Administrative Procedures Act, and that some sort of rulemaking should have happened. But he went further and said, even if the government had engaged in rulemaking, the creation of the program went beyond the government's statutory authority under the Immigration and Nationality Act and the definitions of what's commonly considered prosecutorial discretion. So this is really technical, but the argument in favor of DACA that the Obama administration made, that supporters of DACA have made, and that frankly the Biden administration is making now, is that the determination of whether or not to pursue deportation for any immigrant is a matter of something called prosecutorial discretion, which is in the purview of the executive branch. In other words, they have the ability and the authority and the requirement to enforce. They also have the discretion not to enforce. But what Judge Hannon said was that this program went beyond that normal authority in a couple of different ways. First of all, it was sort of a blanket categorization of prosecutorial discretion for a wide group of people. And the fact is that even though individuals applied and were given status individually, it was very rare that someone who met the criteria was not granted the status, which kind of undermined the idea that it was discretionary. The second thing, and sort of the biggest part of the argument that he made, was that because these people were also granted work authorization and had other benefits that attributed to that, including a court case out of Florida that said that employers could not discriminate in hiring DACA workers, much as they can't discriminate in hiring anybody else who has legal authority to work in the United States, meant that the government, by providing DACA, was essentially providing legal status that Congress had not authorized. So it was a pretty sweeping decision. However, what he did, which was a bit unusual, was he stayed most of his own decision. He said that the government could not adjudicate any applications for new DACA recipients, anybody who hadn't previously had it, but they didn't have to give them back. They just had to hold them. And anybody who currently had DACA status can keep it and can renew it. So in practice, we are essentially where we were under the Trump administration. The program has been paused for anybody who hasn't already have status, but people who have status can keep it. And what was unusual that Judge Hainan stayed his own order is because I believe he fully expected that it would be appealed. And of course, the Biden administration has said they will appeal.
Teresa, thanks. It's a lot there. Sadiksha, I want to turn to you, just because the Biden administration has said that it intends to issue a new rulemaking, I guess, to strengthen and fortify the existing DACA program. Does the court decision affect that rulemaking?
I would say yes, absolutely. I mean, the court decision would make this whole fortifying and strengthening a program very complicated. Since the decision, and I'll go back to what Teresa is saying, if the decision itself of creating this program was unlawful and it circumvented like notice and comment process and it overreaches the executive authority, then you can't really fortify this program. They could initiate a whole new DACA program, but that's a Pandora's box that we don't have to open. But that would also be subject to a judicial review. So yes, it makes the process very complicated. I think after all said and done, where we end up now is in the hands of Congress. Congress needs to decide what to do with this population. And I think that administration is strongly encouraging that as well, because they realize that there is no strengthening a program where a program that's not legal in its standing. So it's in the hands of Congress now.
Well, I'll say that seems to be a point that Judge Hainan and you all agree on here. In Hannan's 2018 decision, he noted, if the nation truly wants to have a DACA program, it is up to Congress to say so. So Teresa, BPC has long called for Congress to address the status of Dreamers. Since leaving the decision up to the courts continues to be like a sword of Damocles over those in the program. Well, what are the options on the table for Congress right now? We've spoken about reconciliation before, and the Senate has included broad legalization in its introductory budget bill. But are there bipartisan options out there?
So, as you said, I think obviously it's up to Congress to create a program that would legalize these folks. We've known that all along. We've known that since the program was created in 2012. I think a couple of things. One is that there have been some bills that have been passed already this Congress. The American Dream and Promise Act, H.R. 6, passed the House earlier this year. The Senate has not taken up action on it yet. That bill would not only provide legal status for many of the Dreamers, but it also address TPS holders and a few other folks. There is a bipartisan DREAM Act. The Senator Dick Durbin and Lindsey Graham reintroduced their bipartisan bill that's been introduced every year for the last decade, but it hasn't really moved in the Senate. I think there was recently an attempt by Senators Cornyn of Texas and Tillis of North Carolina, two Republicans, to introduce a bill that would essentially codify the existing DACA program. This would be narrower than the legalization for the Broad Dreamers program, but it would protect the program that exists right now for those who have it. And that could be a step forward, but many Democrats have rejected that. I think where we are with this program, like a lot of other things, is where we are with a lot of other parts of the immigration system is that there's a lot of party politics happening. As we've discussed, Congress is considering a budget reconciliation effort that would include an awful lot of President Biden's Build Back Better American Family Recovery Plan. And immigration is one of the things in play on that. Immigration advocates are pushing very strongly for Democrats to include broad legalizations for Dreamers, TPS holders, and other essential workers in a Democrat-only reconciliation package that faces a couple of hurdles. The biggest one is that budget reconciliation has some limits on what kinds of things can be included. The so-called Byrd rule in the Senate means that everything that is included in reconciliation has to be related directly to the federal budget, which means it either has to raise revenues or cut costs. Now, there's arguments that legalization programs would raise revenues, in that legalized people would be able to pay taxes and that would increase revenues for the government. But the other half of the Byrd test is that the revenue component or the budgetary component has to be the primary purpose of the policy. And it's on that ground that there are a lot of skeptics as to whether or not it would pass muster. The parliamentarian is the one who rules on these things, although at the end of the day, a vote in Congress can overrule the parliamentarian, but that vote requires 60 votes, not the 50 to pass the reconciliation. So it's a gamble. It's a gamble to try to include this stuff in reconciliation. Remember, the parliamentarian ruled that requiring a minimum wage increase to $15 an hour was not possible in the last reconciliation package that Democrats tried to move. So the parliamentarian has ruled against them in the past. And they have to make sure that they keep all 50 Democrats in the Senate on board. Now, so far, the more moderate Democrats, the ones who everyone's paying attention to, Senator Manchin of West Virginia and Senator Sinema of Arizona, have said they're okay with including immigration on this bill, but it's not the only policy priority that to be included, and this bill could get very, very large. So I think, we've always said that we definitely believe that a bipartisan package is preferable. The more support you can gain for something across the aisle, the stronger it is. Democrats will certainly try to see if they can pass legalization through reconciliation. But if they can't, then I think that it's going to come down to they're going to have to start figuring out what's the next best thing they can do. And if the Senate can't come to agreement on passing something like the American Dream and Promise Act, maybe they go back to the Bipartisan Dream Act. Maybe they even pass something just that would continue the existing program, and then advocates would have to work on larger legislation in the future. But all of those things might be on the table. We probably won't know until later this summer or early fall if the immigration stuff makes it through reconciliation.
I mean, the other thing is that this all takes time, and this affects real people who call this place home. And, how long are Democrats and advocates going to keep testing these different theories as sort of just a quick bull rush through the process? And granted, as you said, it's a low issue or, low stakes issue for it to be added to reconciliation. But who do you see as being the key champions if this doesn't work?
Well, I think if reconciliation doesn't go through, then we have to look to the people that have wanted to do DREAM for a long time. Graham and Durbin, they're the leaders. Now, Graham has been skeptical about the reconciliation. He has also said that he doesn't think even their DREAM Act that he's the co-sponsor of can pass without addressing the border issues that we talked about earlier. Way back in 2017 and 2018, when President Trump tried to end the program and Congress looked at options then, BPC and our immigration task force said that the roadmap to a DACA deal included merging it with some border issues. So maybe that's the path forward. I don't think anybody's ready to start that kind of negotiation just yet. They want to try the gambit and see if it works. But you're right. In the meantime, there's, several 100,000 people who have DACA right now who got a gut punch a week ago and are once again know that, any court any day could rule against them and their status becomes undocumented immediately and they can be deported. And you have anywhere from 50 to 80,000 people who applied for DACA, whose cases were pending at USCIS, who now have nothing and remain in an undocumented status. Plus all of the employers who employ these folks and their families who rely on them. And frankly, there's wide support in the public on both sides of the aisle for legalizing this group of people. So you got to think Congress has to figure out a way to deal with this eventually.
Well, it just shows that these are really important issues that BPC will be tracking, and we hope that everybody tunes in next week to This Week in Immigration. That about does it. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discussed here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow us also on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. I'm Blake Johnson. This Week in Immigration was created by Teresa Cardinal Brown. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Teresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Teresa Cardinal Brown and myself. Ethan Plotkin produces and edits our show. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.